everyone. Hi. My name's Francesca.
And I'm Annie.
And we're two of the curatorial assistants here at the Women's Art Collection. On behalf of our entire team, we'd like to thank everyone here, both online and in person, for attending our academic symposium, Weaving Cultural and Personal Memory. This symposium has been organised in conjunction with our current exhibition, What Lies Beneath, Women, Politics, Textiles. And for those of you who haven't seen it yet, we really encourage you to take a trip to our exhibition space in the college just over the road. The aim of our exhibition was to bring together the works of an international group of women artists working in textiles from across generations and styles in order to shine a light on a media which, until very recently, was not given the time or space it deserved, and to highlight the contributions of women textile artists, their communities, and the history of art.
So in the same vein, the symposium has brought together scholars and artists to further explore the themes of the exhibition, across the road. The works and artists you will hear about today have used textiles, a media long associated with the domestic, as a tool to illustrate and speak to both personal and cultural memories, politics, and histories. This symposium consists of 3 sessions, each followed by a question and answer portion and a short break. For those of you watching online, please feel free to submit questions in the chat box as well. In the final session, beginning at 5:30 p.m., you will hear from our 2 keynote speakers who we are very excited to have with us in person today, Curator of International Art at the Tate, Anne Coxon, and artist Praminda Kaur. Before we begin, we would like to thank Murray Edwards College, the Art Fund, the Levin Hume Foundation, and our 2 curators, Naomi Polonsky and Dr. Lorna Dillon. Thank you for coming, and with that, we'll start our first session. Thank you.
One sec. Can everyone hear me? Hello, thank you for coming. I'm CJ Salapare, and today I'm going to be talking to you about some of the woven trapunto works of Philippine artist Pacita Abad. So I want to begin from this particular work in that series called Filipino, A Racial Identity Crisis, because it really lays the groundwork for the aesthetic concerns, for the political purviews, and for the kind of cross-cultural way of thinking or philosophy that Pacita Abad espoused throughout her life. So here we have 2 different representations, colonial and indigenous, of a Filipino woman. So already she's trafficking within this kind of representational economy. But what's really fascinating to me is the ways that she's able to collapse both of these figures into one plane of coexistence, wherein we're able to kind of see a visual and aesthetic and perhaps a political or a kind of feminine kind of balance or rejoinder through the profusion of pattern here. So something that's really fascinating to me is this insistence on textile and fabric, whether that be in terms of how she renders the figure on the left in this kind of colonial way of dress, barot sayat, or the right as a composite of these indigenous textiles and forms of dress. And you see this form of collapse or pattern collapse even further in the ways that the backgrounds of both of the figures are also rendered in a similar kind of textiled and textured way. So this is precisely where I want to begin and where I want to situate my work within a representational matrix, and specifically within the crux of identity politics, which is how do we kind of avoid the traps of figurative essentialism while still kind of sidestepping or evading the pitfalls of universalism. And so within the spectrum, I'm arguing, or I'm positing, that the artist Pacita Abad really renders the signifiers and associations of identity along feminine and Philippine lines as fluid and not fixed, a condition that's in keeping with the kind of formation and the development of discourses surrounding immigration in the Philippines vis-a-vis the Philippine-American diaspora, and which the haptic kind of active dimensions of weaving really metaphorize and embody. So, this talk really previews a set of concerns that I have in terms of the woven spaces of Philippine diaspora through the works of Abad and David Medalla. But for now, I'm focusing or kind of narrowing my remit to Philippine American diaspora. So some context for Pacita Abad. She was born in 1946 in Batanes, the northernmost island of the Philippine archipelago. And she was going to follow a career in politics during the advent of the Marcos regime before being forced to leave the country out of safety, and a kind of prescient, a really important layover turned residence period in San Francisco during the 1960s. For some context, when immigration reform, civil rights, and the establishment of Asia America as a pan-ethnic cultural category or means of solidarity were fully underway, prompted her to shift from a kind of political career to a more artistic one. But it's not to say that she left that kind of political backbone. I really feel like that serves as the undertow for her aesthetic sensibilities and ways of thinking. She first began as a painter dealing with matters of representing marginal communities. So one big thing to note is that Pacita was not only extremely prolific, but also quite peripatetic. Her husband, Jack Garrity, was working within the finance circuit working in finance on the international circuit. So they would actually travel all throughout the world and specifically within the global south, and they would have long-term stays in those places. So it wasn't just her dipping in and out. She really became invested and integrated with the local communities of color and also with the OFWs, or overseas foreign workers and Philippine workers who were there. So in the vein of, let's say, Alice Neal with her kind of tender depictions of her subjects toward a kind of, not romanticization, but like a kind of ode to human imperfection, to human texture. I think Pacita Abad's kind of early figurative words speak to that. So these are kind of examples from her Cambodian refugee series, so people she had encountered and met and spoken and empathized with at the refugee camps in the aftermath of the Khmer Rouge. Something that's really important, though, or a really important hallmark, is when she began experimenting with the Trapunto Technique, beginning in 1981, when she encountered a doll maker friend in Boston who showed her how to give heft and weight to mere fabric, thread, and cotton. But instead of taking or replicating that literally, she decides to use it as a ground for experimentation, toggling between abstract and representational vocabularies. So this is one of her earliest kind of Trapunto series, which involves first painting the first layer of unstretched canvas, then secondly, stuffing it with either cotton or polyurethane foam, and third, encrusting and threading and embroidering it with various bits of material, whether it be mirrors or sequins or feathers, and eventually materials that she would collect over the course of her international travels. So already you see a cultural and material syncretism playing out on this textured picture plane, if I can even call it that. So this work really speaks of a kind of an interest in spatializing the vocabularies of history. Here it seems like a kind of interplay between geometric or angular geometry and these sinuous, colorful, iridescent forms. But the title speaks to a kind of architectural frame that she situates this work in. So Sampaloc is actually the Spanish colonial center of Manila, and so she's bringing that to the fore, really surfacing that here in what otherwise seems like a kind of play on different. It seems like a formal play otherwise. She's also very, very much interested in scale, but not in terms of monumentality, but in terms of how it brings forth an idea or a kind of ethos of communality. And by this, I'm thinking about it in terms of the scale as a whole, but also in terms of its scalable parts and the relational push and pull that exists between them. So here she relies on the kind of the scaffolding or the support of a spider web to show that and you can really intimate the process that's happening here, where she draws these larger kind of lines that bisect or that kind of dissect the picture plane, and then how it kind of almost practically or organically turns into smaller bits and scales. So here we kind of see a fluid way of thinking, through all of these different forms. So what I'm proposing in my dissertation is that Pacita Abad, through the use of Trapunto, actually approaches the surface as a kind of interface, where she's able to not only toggle between, let's say, pattern as a kind of fabric, pattern as woven fabric, or pattern as the surface of surface architecturally or spatially, but also in terms of the surface's skin, thereby bringing all of those into a kind of syncretic matrix, which is, I mean, quite revolutionary during the time that she was working in, and which I think needs to have a lot of critical scholarship to serve as a kind of remedy for that. So here you have an example of how she's really experimenting or kind of demonstrating that impulse at play, where the body itself is kind of made or shaped by these patterns that coalesce, and where space, figure, and body and surface really kind of exist on a similar plane, or how texture is given by this kind of syncopation of line, a form of zigzag and circle. So I'll run through the next couple of bits so I can get to the Immigrant Experience series, but you can, she's also thinking about syncretism through her Masks and Spirits series, which kind of pays homage to the various kind of indigenous groups that she met both in Africa and Southeast Asia. So the Tate actually recently acquired these works, and here's a sense of scale of them at Tate Liverpool. And with that being said, she's also really interested in this idea of the multitude, or in turning to other kind of models of being together along lines of difference that don't necessarily reify a kind of individuality, but reinforce a kind of communality. So in this Underwater series, you see that laid out so beautifully. You quite literally see multitude along lines of color, along lines of form, where color itself is both a form of camouflage, which invokes these ideas of assimilation, right? But also this idea of standing out. So that's also something I'm thinking about. Here's a sense of scale with some of the other Underwater series paintings. And so with all of these ideas in mind, I'm thinking about the kind of Trapunto patterns that she creates as a way, or specifically through the ways that they proliferate, or patterning as a proposition or a lens through which we can examine surface, space, and system in a more holistic and nuanced way. Ooh, sorry. So in the Immigration Experience series, she's really trying to grapple with things that are, I guess from one perspective, completely incomprehensible or incommensurable in their totality. But she kind of finds ways to scale things down, scale things up, and present a perspective that taps into these depictions of the immigrant experience that are not only speak to Philippine immigration, but might also provide lines of cross-cultural solidarity. So here she's really asking what forms an urban fabric and how can we depict it from a minoritarian standpoint. So here you see her using the grid as a structuring mechanism in terms of the urban footprint and the skyscrapers and the kind of histories of modernism that those invoke, but also speaking to a kind of underlying or an underbelly of modernism, which is all of these signifiers of capitalism and commodification through all of the signs that are plastered, not only in terms of these facades, but quite literally in the sky and in the atmosphere. And then down below, a la, let's say, Jacob Lawrence, right, she presents these scenes of togetherness of Filipino OFWs who are carrying different shopping bags, who are finding a sense of community among one another, and who typically work in domestic industries such as, or domestic industries or nursing. And you see this action, or the depictions of these actions, indexing certain processes of remittance, or of kind of, most of them, or presumably, are purchasing these goods to bring back to their loved ones in the Philippines, of this dream of disposable income that really scaffolds or kind of helps to help this kind of not American dream, but the dream of immigration to persist. And of a kind of materialism that's not critical, but that's more empathetic, that's born from a place and from a generation of scarcity. In the interest of time, I'll skip this, but she was included in a seminal show on contemporary Asian American art. And so you see in this work, or in the next two works, she's really interested in asking what forms the fabric of our memory and of history and of narrative, both along our individual lines, but also collective ones. And she turns to the act of weaving or imbricating those together as one possible way out or one possible means of understanding these issues. So here we have a work called I Thought the Streets Were Paved with Gold that speaks to certain American realities. And so you have all of these indexes of labor that I had spoken about. So you have the nurse. A lot of Filipinos come to America to work in the nursing industry in particular. We have these forms of domestic help, et cetera. We have this it's all enclosed in a kind of fence up at the top. And if you see certain details of this work, you'll see how Pacita plays with these semiotic slippages, wherein one form never concretizes into one meaning. So if you see at the very edge, she's quite literally lined it with the thread. And she's also collaged different figures that she's painted before, so she's quite literally collapsing everything onto one plane. But what's interesting is, especially in relation to, let's say, like the nurse and to the fence, you have one form of weaving or one pattern that speaks to exclusion, and then you have this thread kind of signifying something else, perhaps something like a suture or something that dresses up a wound. So all of that kind of exists within this kind of landscape or mosaic that she creates. So this is a kind of pendant piece to that, where instead of speaking to American realities, she's speaking to what kind of subtends the American dream, or the kind of the trappings of materialism that leave one kind of disillusioned by what ends up taking place. So you have all of the markers of what success looks like, whether it be the car, the house, the kitchen, the plenitude of food, but the dissatisfied figure in the middle. And so she's really kind of toying or kind of showing both sides of those, both sides of the immigrant experience, but never fully settling on one definition or the other. So I think I'm definitely running over time. So I just want to end here with LA Liberty, where you see this color as a double entendre played out so beautifully. So this is actually a kind of a riff on, well, yes, the Statue of Liberty, but also the absence of it vis-a-vis Angel Island, which was the westernmost point where most Asian American immigrants would come in from the Pacific. And so she's actually completely questioned and reworked the fabric of what a nation means, or specifically what this kind of, or how this imaginary takes place. And so you already see here, even her skin is completely clad in fabric. Her hand holding the torch, her arm, and her actual robe doesn't necessarily show doesn't rely on three-dimensionality. It shows a kind of topography or terrain, right, wherein pattern speaks for itself or speaks for this difference. Also the tablet, right? She's really thinking about material as metaphor. So, in conclusion, I'm arguing that through the Immigrant Experience series, she provides woven rejoinders to histories of invisibility, both in terms of art and art history, but also in terms of political representation, giving not only a face to representation, but a mode and a method to the ways that immigration inflects and inheres itself inseparably into artistic form. So quite literally surfacing what lies beneath. Thank you.
Hi everyone, I'm Yupeng. I'm currently a student at the Courtauld Institute of Art, and the title of my presentation today is Exhibiting Miao Embroidered Textiles, Internal Orientalism, and the Reimagining of an Ethnic Minority Identity in China. So I first want to acknowledge that this paper grew out of my research on a collection of Miao embroidered textiles as an intern at the University of Pennsylvania Museum of Anthropology and Archaeology in 2019. And I further developed my interest in Miao textiles and Chinese minority politics into a research project for the Hannah Holborn Gray Fellowship at Bryn Mawr College in 2020 as COVID-related lockdowns halted travel opportunities. I had to abandon my original proposal, which relied heavily on ethnographic methods, and switch to a study of museum representation. I want to thank the people who have made this research possible in the middle of a global pandemic, including Steve Lang, keeper of the Asian section at the Penn Museum, Ruth Barnes, curator of Indo-Pacific art at the Yale University Art Gallery, and Professor Sylvia Hodelane and Amanda Whiteman at Bryn Mawr College History of Art and Anthropology departments. Miaozu, the official name of the Miao people, is the 5th largest officially recognized minority group among a total of 55 in China. Indigenous to southwest China, the Miao population scatter over more than 8 provinces in the country, with extensive concentrations in Guizhou, where half the population is Miao, Hunan, and Yunnan. The Miao also have an extensive diasporic community outside China known as the Hmong in countries like Vietnam, Laos, and the United States. In China, minority politics, the identity politics that concerns ethnic minorities, is a system that creates solidarity out of protective forms of diversity. In other words, it is a system that reserves certain spaces for difference for the sake of overall homogeneity. The Miao have been subject to various forms of inclusion and exclusion within the system of minority politics of the Communist Party state, a system that centers the experience of the Han majority. This paper looks at the embroidered textiles of the Miao people in the context of minority politics. This is one example of a Miao embroidered textile. So Miao embroidered textiles are an essential part of the material culture of Miao people who draw inspiration from their traditional song and creation epics. Despite some scholarly attention given to the Miao embroidery, studies on the collections and exhibitions of these textiles are particularly thin, if not entirely lacking. To remedy this oversight, I focus on museum exhibitions that feature Miao embroidered textiles, both inside and outside China, as a way of representing the material culture of the minority ethnic group. I take inspiration from scholarship on museological practices that consider the multiple discursive frames through which objects on display acquire and change meanings in the museum institution. I look at museum exhibitions as a vehicle of the production, reproduction, and circulation of knowledge, and pay close attention to donor information, provenance of the objects, and curatorial frameworks to examine the ways in which Miao textiles are collected and exhibited. Moreover, the study takes an interdisciplinary approach that combines cultural anthropology, museum studies, and art history to disentangle the complex ways in which the identity of Miao embroidered textiles and the Miao people are produced and reproduced in these processes and practices of exhibition and collection. The production of the concept of Mingzu, which roughly translates to nationality in English, and the power relations behind the hierarchies of various ethnic groups are central to my argument. As anthropologist Drew Gladney has argued, the representation of the minorities reveal more about the majority than the minorities themselves. By scrutinizing these exhibitions that feature Miao embroidered textiles, this paper also considers what the representation of the Miao material culture reveals about the identity of the Han majority, the cornerstone of Chinese nationalism. Through looking closely at 2 museum exhibitions, Lasting Tales from an Imaginative Hands at the Hermes Maison in Shanghai, and Ceremonial Dress from Southwest China, the M.B. Goodman collection at the Yale University Art Gallery, which were both on display in 2019, I argue that through selectively showcasing certain types of costumes, specifically women's festival costumes that are more aesthetically pleasing and have more varieties, these exhibitions give a false impression that these elaborate women's festival costumes represent the typical Miao costumes, along with museum designs that draw attention to the vibrant color and other formal qualities of the textiles, and a general neglect in contextualizing individual objects on display and the social values of the costumes in these communities. The staging of these exhibitions lead viewers to confuse that which is typical and authentic with the exotic. By showcasing only textiles that are elaborate and vibrant, these exhibitions reveal a highly imagined and glaringly exoticized construction of the Miao, of the material culture of Miao people. There's been a long history of representing the Miao and other ethnic minority groups from a non-minority perspective in China. Starting from the late 17th century in the Qing dynasty, a distinct proto-ethnographic genre of illustrated manuscript called Miao albums emerged. These albums contain watercolor paintings of the quotidian life of Miao tribes and serve to educate Qing officials about various minority ethnic groups so that they could govern these groups more efficiently. An illustrated account of the otherness of Miao tribal life, these Miao albums played a key role in fomenting the imperial ambitions of the Qing court, which was grounded in the dichotomy of us versus them. In the Mao era and beyond, the Communist Party of China produced a series of visually distinctive, highly idealized propaganda posters. One of the themes of these posters is the unity of all nationalities, usually with romanticized representations of young ethnic minority women from all nationalities, each in their colorful ethnic costume, dancing and celebrating the great leaders of the party. In these images, ethnic minorities, especially minority women, are signifiers of social prosperity, national unity, and also the lack of progress and education in a pedagogical and hierarchical relationship. These posters are effective vehicles for the dissemination of the nationalistic agenda of the party state. They help classify and organize the diversity of its people and normalize the unmarked identity of the Han majority. Such romanticized representations of ethnic minorities, especially of minority women, permeate various realms of contemporary Chinese life. Contemporary Chinese comics, for example, produce various characters of ethnic minority backgrounds, often relying on ethnic costumes as markers of ethnic and gender identity. The visual representation of these ethnic minority characters reveal various imaginings of a Miao identity in popular culture. All these images of Miao people form a visual archive that circulate in popular imagination. These images of Miao people also reveal a close relationship between their costumes and their identity. In these visual representations, costumes are often used as a ubiquitous signifier of the other. Louisa Shine, an anthropologist who specializes in the Miao, claimed that ethnic costumes are the hallmarks of Miao identity for the symbolic forces they carry in public and often political appearances. Why are costumes the predominant signifier of an ethnic body, especially that of a minority woman? I will expand on this question at the end of my presentation today. As a continuation of the tradition of representing Miao people and their material culture, my paper looks at representations in the museum world and how new meanings are produced through museum exhibitions. Due to the time limit today, I'll use one of the exhibitions I discuss in my paper, Lasting Tales from Imaginative Hands at the Hermes Maison in Shanghai, as an example of how Miao textiles and Miao people are represented through limited frameworks in museum and gallery spaces. The first thing that catches one's eye as one enters a museum space is the vibrant colors of the exquisitely embroidered Miao costumes. The bold use of contrasting hues, yellow and purple or red and green, draws the attention of the audience and satisfies their desire to see typical Miao costumes, which implies a certain undiluted intensity of folk color and an unbroken connection to the past, to quote Louisa Shine again. The setting of the gallery in a classic art museum style, with white walls, white pedestals, and glass display stands, also serve to further intensify the visual experience of the contrasting colors of the costumes, a neutral white ground on which bold color stands. Upon closer inspection, however, one observes a selective display of certain types of costumes and textiles. Most costumes shown in this exhibition were women's costumes, which are more adorned and much more varied in style and design than men's or children's clothes. This predilection for women's costume reveals an intention to appeal to the eyes. For minority costumes, and men appear less varied and exotic. The dullness of minority men's costumes make them less preferable options for museum exhibitions that aim at showcasing the ethnic aesthetics of minority costumes. In fact, there were only 2 pieces of men's clothing in this exhibition, and even those were much more adorned than the typical men's garments, which consist of plain indigo and black shirts and pants. Furthermore, most of the costumes that were exhibited are festival costumes, not everyday clothing. The Miao 100 Birds costume featured in this exhibition, for example, is a piece made by Miao embroiderers according to the original patterns and measurements of their ancient models. The 100 Birds costume is one of the most elaborate and celebrated costumes of the Miao that is reserved strictly for festivities. Commissioned by the Hermes Maison in 2013, this piece took the embroiderers an entire year to finish, covered with delicate patterns of birds, frogs, and fish that were embroidered with silk threads of various colors. The 100 Birds costume epitomizes the intricacy of the embroidered patterns and the bold use of contrasting colors in Miao festival costumes, especially those of women. Without clear labels that contextualize the intended wearers and the occasions that these costumes are put on, the exhibition gives a false impression that these elaborate women's festival costumes are the typical and the authentic. This supposed norm, which entails a palette of vibrant colors that signifies both the exotic and the backward, reveals a highly imagined and romanticized construction of the material culture of the ethnic minority group. The staging of legitimacy in the exhibition is a response to the desire of what is considered the ethnic. Through circulating, producing, and performing these constructed norms, museums further reify this imagining of the Miao in these exhibitions. Toward the end of the exhibition, there was also a contemporary sculptural piece named Mobius Continuous that was commissioned by the Foundation. This sculptural work was created by a non-Miao artist and fashion designer, Cici Chan, who's also the founder and owner of a high fashion designer brand. Chan combined the traditional Miao embroidered cloth and form of the Mobius ring to, quote, explore the infinite possibility of the ancient Chinese craft. According to Chan, the Mobius ring symbolizes infinite circulation and harmonious coexistence of contradictory forces, which implies that the perceived incompatibility of Miao embroidery, which is considered traditional and ancient, and the sculptural form, which is contemporary. This notion of Miao textiles as a static and anachronistic tradition reveals the delimiting historicization of the textiles and the people. By showcasing mainly festival costumes of women that look more exotic with their vibrant colors and delicate embroidered patterns, exhibitions like Lasting Tales from Imaginative Hands highlight the otherness not only of these costumes, but the Miao people at large, as a result of the selected display of what is more aesthetically pleasing to a largely westernized audience. Festival costumes, known as shenzhuang in Chinese, are used and manipulated to visualize ethnic minorities in Southwest China. Festival clothes from ethnic minorities are often collected, preserved, and exhibited as material culture in their own right. Such selective inclusion reveals the prejudice and violence of the archive and collection practices in museums. From the very beginning, museum collections served to display colonies to people of the empire. Thus, imperialistic practices are inherent in museums. It is through museum exhibition and collection that the exotic margins of the empire are brought home and absorbed into the national imaginary. Anthropologist Louisa Shine coins the term internal Orientalism, which entails Orientalistic practices within the Orient, a concept that exposes imperialist practices in non-European countries despite the divergent histories of European colonialism and imperialism in Asia. Informed by local history and power dynamics, internal Orientalist practices are imperialist practices that are internal. Like Oriental subjects in the West, minority groups in China are commoditized, objectified, exoticized, and often eroticized. According to literary critic Edward Said, Orientalism, the collective fantasy of the enigmatic other, also constitutes part of the European self. Said's scholarship on the Orient has received many criticisms since its publication, one of them being that such a way of regarding the East as incapable of othering not only massive imperialist and colonial practices within the East, but also stabilizes and rectifies the divide between the East and the West. Even though the two are not exact parallels, the Han majority's problematic fascination with an exhibition of ethnic minorities in contemporary China mirrors the practices of Western Orientalism. Returning to the question of why costumes are used as ubiquitous signifiers of ethnic identity, it is because they're seemingly innocuous. In this case, museums showcase what is considered non-threatening and even palatable to a national audience, which reveals the domestication of the difference of the Miao. Such selective celebration of the Miao material culture and people is a celebration of diversity only in selective spaces, while the same culture and the same people are excluded in other contexts. That is, these exhibitions recognize and erase otherness simultaneously through only embracing part of a culture and a group of people. To exhibit the costumes of ethnic minorities, museums have to be conscious of the exoticization and historicization of the textiles and the people and actively deconstruct them through providing social and historical context of individual objects and emphasizing the status quo of the craft to show that it is an ever-evolving tradition. Thank you.
Hello, can you hear me? Yeah. Thank you for inviting me today to present my paper. I'm a first-year PhD student at the Courtauld Institute of Art, and I'm going to talk about the Duchesse de Maine, who is the figure that I'm writing about in my first year of PhD. So my paper examines two sets of tapestries that belong to the collections of the Duc and the Duchesse de Maine. The Duchess, Anne-Louise Bénédicte, was born in 1676 as a Princesse du Sang from a cadet branch of the line of Bourbon, the House of Condé. In 1692, she was married to the illegitimate son of Louis XIV and Madame de Montespan, Louise Auguste de Bourbon, Duc du Maine. Because of this union, Louise Bénédicte lost her princely status and was relegated to a lower rank at court, an offense that she compensated for through the creation of a court of her own at the Château des Sceaux, a perfect example of the so-called satellite courts that proliferated towards the end of Louis XIV's reign. So differed from the rest for the pronounced salon character that the Duchess imbued her gatherings with, as well as for the outstanding festivities, des divertissements, which she personally organized and in which she starred. The aim of this paper is to rethink the Duchess's action, discussing it as political, both on the grounds of status and gendered identity. Rather than restricting the analysis to patronage, this paper selects textile works that were in the couple's common collections to examine the ways in which these were used. The paper poses crucial questions about display and displacement. I interrogate specific items on the reasons why they were moved from one residence to another, how their display influenced the perception of a space's character and of its owners accordingly. I argue that the maneuvering of these sets formed part of a broader action of appropriation, one that infiltrated space, iconography, and taste. I discuss how these choices participated in one strategy to internalize male, culturally strong character into her decorative practice while infusing the single objects with a personal feminine connotation. The first series I address is The Fable of Phaeton, which thematizes one aspect of the much exploited allegory of the sun god, the one of his offspring. Woven approximately 1665-1685, its design was even earlier. In consideration of the scene's height, the series was identified as a Brussels reweaving by Jean Lignier II of a 16th century design by Pieter Kirke van Aelst. The set shown here is part of the collection of the Nelson Atkins Museum of Art in Kansas City. Its provenance only dates back to the 1930s, so that it has not been yet possible to prove whether this set corresponds to the one in the possession of the Dukes du Maine. The tapestries, most arguably commissioned by Madame de Montespan, had long been in the family possessions, and they came into the Duke's collection in 1707, when he inherited the castle of Clagny from his mother. However, his after-death inventory of 1736 shows that the tapestries were neither left there nor, if not momentarily, brought to Sceaux, which was the couple's main residence at the time. Instead, they were moved partly to Arsenal and partly to the Hôtel du Maine. The 6 pieces illustrate the Ovidian myth of the troubled son of Helios, the Greek Apollo, who, having won recognition of his paternity, borrowed his father's chariot, only to die in a spectacular fall from the sky. The one tapestry representing the epilogue, the Fall of Phaeton, or as the museum has recently renamed it, as Zeus strikes Phaeton with a thunderbolt, depicts a moment in which the father of the gods, concerned about Phaeton having lost control of the chariot, decides to put an end to its ride. This piece was most significantly hung at Arsenal, the one residence to embody a status given by office rather than royal blood. So this was the Duke, where the Duke resided because of his charge as Grand Maître de l'Artillerie. This constituted a very delicate theme for the bastard son of the Sun King to handle. The story would have resonated with 18th century viewers who had witnessed the historical incident of the recognition in 1714 by Louis XIV of his illegitimate children, which was then swiftly revoked by the Parliament in 1715 at the death of the king. Charissa Bremer Javid, who has studied the patronage of Madame de Montespan and her family, envisioned the possibility for the Duke to have displayed the set so prominently within his Paris residences as a cautionary reminder of his own precarious footing at court. It is hard to believe that it was his personal initiative to keep this disastrous prospect on site, least of all on display. Being informed by primary sources about the tone and content of most disputes between him and his wife, this choice resembles more of a statement, one on the part of the Duchess. Their main point of collision related precisely to legitimacy, which, as she liked to remind him, was an element of superiority on her side. She used to intimidate him with the notion that only through her he could have produced a pure bloodline descendancy. The act of displacement and public display of these tapestries, recorded by the diary of the family steward Pierre-Jacques Brion, speaks of an attack to her husband for his loss of position in the line of succession to the throne. In fact, she was offering a visual exposition of the outcome if he were to take the reins of power, or retroactively, of how it went when his father did receive him as his rightful heir. The perspective of a failure found additional support in the contemporary descriptions of the Duke, profiled as unfit for ruling and even unmanly. This vilification of her husband's condition was not an end in itself, but served to prepare the field for pleading her case, to outline the reverse situation to her natural stepping into the role. In the same years, she had started to position herself in relation to the iconography of the sun related to Louis XIV, in order to further her aims to socio-political advancement. Instead of creating an original alternative, she had taken on a fully functioning, ready-to-use vocabulary in which she simply substituted the figure at its core with hers. This process of appropriation was initiated within the interiors of the Pavillon de l'Aurore at Sceaux. The pavilion, a hymn to dawn, had been erected by Charles Perrault in 1670 and its dome ceiling painted by Charles Lebrun in 1672 with the allegory of Aurora. Accompanied by dew and murmur, Aurora rises to the zenith on her golden chariot to chase away the night. Commissioned by Jean-Baptiste Colbert, the first minister of Louis XIV, the theme gained vivid political meaning. Dawn stood for Colbert himself, who prepared the arrival of the Sun King. By celebrating in here the Grande Nuit of 1714-1715, a series of late events dedicated to night, Louise Benedict overthrew the meaning of the space and its decoration. In the fifth of these nights, Sleep, disturbed by a loud assembly, escaped the castle to find temporary refuge at the pavilion. However, he is soon chased away again, and decisively by the Duchess herself, who, acting the part of night, finally triumphs. Her identification in this symbolism was the most appropriate since she suffered from insomnia, and for it presented her as the natural continuation of day. The Duchess's artistic choices did not aim to contrast those of the male figures in her orbit, but rather to appropriate and translate them in the feminine form by performing the gender roles permitted by her status. It should be interpreted as an attempt to make sense of gender as key in individuals' possibilities and to turn it to her favor. The second series is the Histoire de l'Empereur de la Chine, designed and woven at the Royal Beauvais Tapestry Manufactory at the end of the 17th century. This series rapidly gained in popularity as the taste for chinoiserie expanded, so much that 18 sets were produced. The popular series was finally abandoned at Beauvais in 1732 when the cartoons were so worn that they could no longer serve their purpose. The pictures shown here are from the fourth edition of the series, which was produced between 1697 and 1705 for the Château de Rambouillet of the Comte de Toulouse, the brother of the Duc de Maine. The set is now divided between the Musée des Compiègnes and the Getty Museum of Los Angeles. This exotic and highly elaborate set illustrates the everyday life of the Chinese emperors and their empresses. The series was woven under the direction of Philippe Aigle by the flower painters Jean-Baptiste Belin de Fontenay and Jean-Baptiste Mornaillet, and Guy Vernansal, whose signature on various models implies that he was the main designer of the series. While the exact dating of the first woven set is difficult to define with certainty, it was most likely created after Behagle took over the directorship in 1684 and before Mornaillet left for England in 1690. An undated memorandum by Behagle identifies the Duc de Maine 9-piece set, which location is unknown today, as the Editio Princeps. It was woven with gold thread, rarely used by Beauvais, and sold by Monsieur Disrode to Monsieur le Duc de Maine for 20,000 livres. The most important element of this transaction is that Monsieur Disrode acted as an intermediary, while the set was actually manufactured for the Duke. As a teenager, the Duc de Maine had witnessed the cross-cultural exchanges between the court of France and representatives from Siam and China. He met the Jesuit Couplet and his Chinese converts when they first returned from China. He participated in the glamorous reception organized by his father, Louis XIV, on the 1st of September 1686 at Versailles for the Chinese ambassadors. These encounters broadened the intellectual and aesthetic horizons of the young Duke and ignited his fascination with the Far East. Indeed, Louis Auguste actively recommended sending a corresponding French mission to Siam and China. The inventory of 1736 reveals that the set was devalued at his death, and most interestingly, that prior to it, it had been split amongst the residences, with a few pieces in particular being moved from Arsenal to the Hôtel du Maine. The Journal of Brion closely follows the episode of the displacement of the Duke's furniture perpetrated by the Duchess on the night of 29 January 1723. This event needs to be contextualized in the frame of the Salapare conspiracy and the consequent exile, on the return from which the Duke had been threatening her of divorcing. She was held responsible for the whole conspiracy. In this light, the action formed part of a strategy to convince him to move back in with her, and specifically, not as so, but into her newly built urban mansion, where they would have more visibility. The exact impact of this maneuver on the final decision of the Duke to move into the hotel, which happened exactly 1 year later and is again narrated by Brion, is hard to gauge. Certainly, though, the selection of these tapestries in particular confirms that these were objects known and dear to him, important carriers of meaning for both. Though following opposite trajectories, these choices of display and displacement reflect her agency as she pushed against him the public perception of the couple and its intrinsic power relation, and broadly of her as an individual in relation to the male counterparts in her life. As it was the case for the first set, the action accomplished on pre-existing objects worked also on the level of a thematic translation on further commissions. What from the Fable of Phaeton took the form of an iconographic re-elaboration functioned here more in terms of taste. In 1722, the Duchess ordered the creation of a Cabinet de la Chine at the Hôtel du Maine, the same residence to which part of the tapestries had been moved to. Destined to later become a major vogue, very few rooms of this kind existed in Paris by this time, and none yet directly commissioned by a woman. The sheer lack of external examples would on its own support the assumption that inspiration must have derived from her husband's model. For this decorative program, the Duchess chose to rework screens of Chinese lacquer panels acquired from the inventory of the warehouse of the Marquis de la Force, who had been tried in Parliament for engaging in commerce, and his goods had been confiscated. Her commitment to this project was extremely personal and active. She summoned the inspector responsible for the De La Force seizure the very night of the event, previewed the inventory personally, and in February 1722, she convened both her architect Armand-Claude Mollet and her steward Brion to see the screens, which she had ordered to be transported to Arsenal. The gilded mouths are the most interesting bits. These were added to the screens once they had been fitted to the walls, and they juxtaposed chinoiserie to Chinese. Though commentators have generally focused on their function to frame and hold the screens together, it is worth distinguishing between the vegetal motifs that run around the borders and the magots chinois set within the arabesque structures attached to the middle of the panels. Sorry about the quality of the pictures, but I cannot access the physical, the building, because it's now the embassy, the American embassy in Paris. So I can't access, I had to scan these from a book. So the figure gained eminence by covering and upsetting the originals, to the point that the Chinese lacquer behind them functions almost as a backdrop landscape on which they act as the main subject. Their hats and poses remind of some secondary figures in The Breakfast and The Empress Sailing from the Beauvais series. They hold up and are suspended on objects that resemble to the parasols and pagodas depicted in the tapestries. The one down there on the left and up here on the right. These elements testify to the absorption of China and the Far East, not firsthand, but filtered through the daily experience of the textile set, which hung in the Duke's residences since before their marriage. Instead of choosing general Eastern-style motifs, Louise Benedict made direct reference to his collection. Her intention was to be thought of in relation to him, not only as his wife, at a time when this was at risk, but also as his opponent, the one able to master his taste, outdo him, and overturn his prerogative. In conclusion, the appropriation I defined developed in successive phases that altogether formed the final image of her feminist practice. The Duchess managed to create a stronger female identity by drawing a different point from each role she performed. The innovation of her femininity laid in its complexity, which escaped one final definition, in the re-elaboration of different vocabularies and constant shift of perspectives in this exercise. Her fundamental characteristic consisted of this ephemerality, performative at its core. Perhaps this is best illustrated in the way that she was perceived by those closest to her, such as her lady-in-waiting, who described her as semblable à la lumière, qui est l'assemblage de toutes les couleurs et ne peut être représentée que par un d'elle. A woman like light, composed of all colors. Thank you.
Okay, you should all have a microphone that works, in theory. Yep. Thank you everyone for being here, and thank you so much to our speakers, Camilla, CJ, Yupeng, and Nicole. Thank you for your wonderful presentations and gorgeous images that you brought along with you as well. So now we're just going to have 15 minutes to take some questions. We do have people watching online, but we also have all of you here in person, which is lovely. So if anyone has any questions, just raise your hand and one of our runners will come to you with a microphone. Oh, we've got one from Lorna here.
Hi, so I have a few questions for Yupeng. The first one is specific. Can you hear me? The first one is specifically about the Miao. You mentioned that, it's hard for me to paraphrase what you said, but I think you're saying that in some contexts, this the this minority group is excluded or not included, and that you don't see the exhibitions that includes their work as altering that. So I just wonder if you could speak a little. That's the first question. I wondered if you could speak a little bit more about that, specifically with regard to the Miao textiles. And I'll just give you my other couple of questions, and I can repeat them if you forget. So the second question was about these Chinese textiles in particular. Who stitches them, and are there any human rights issues surrounding that? And the third issue was, it's not really connected to the Miao people, but I just wondered if these, and this is someone actually recently asked me to curate an exhibition of this kind of textile, so I was wondering if there are any issues, political issues, regarding the situation between China and Tibet, and whether any of these, like, these traditional dresses are sort of involved in that issue. I can repeat them if you can't remember them all.
So, your first question is about kind of the selective inclusion of Miao textiles, specifically in the museum space, and you want me to talk more about that, or? Yeah. Okay. Yeah, I think kind of my main argument for this piece is that I really just noticed that, like, it's not just the Miao, but like there are 54 other ethnic minority groups in China, and the only way you see them represented in media and also like the museum spaces, you only see the most adorned dresses, and you see this very, I think it has kind of the influence from early ethnographic practices of trying to absorb these diverse populations into like the empire. So you only see them like their musical and their kind of their festival tradition part of it. But yeah, you really don't see other kind of I guess clothes that they would wear normally, and that's and one other thing that I noticed is that for museum collections, like not only in China but also in the West, is that you don't even see, they don't even digitize these images, even if they have these casual clothing, like tie-dyed clothing that Miao people would wear normally. They don't even digitize these images, so the only thing you would see is like these heavily adorned, embroidered clothing. If that answers part of your questions, we can have more of a conversation later too. And your second question, could you repeat that? Yeah. 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 I guess in terms of who embroiders them, it really depends on if you're talking about in the past or now, because now they're very, very commercialized for kind of they cater to tourists who visit these villages. So there will be like a lot of factories that mass manufacture these things. But traditionally, it's usually women teaching their younger female relatives, like daughters, niece, like people like that, and they would just sit in the circle and just chat and sing and embroider together. And in terms of human rights issue, actually my original proposal for this project, I was doing it when COVID first hit. I wanted to go visit and do an ethnographic study on the workshops, contemporary workshops of these like looking at how these textiles are produced now, specifically like the more commercial ones, and I do think they work in pretty bad conditions now, but I can't tell you more about that because I didn't get to do it. But and your third question?
Tibetan.
Yeah, actually, I don't know too much about like Tibetan textiles. Like one interesting thing that I do notice about these traditional Tibetan costumes is that a lot of like Han Chinese, like Han majority Chinese tourists, when they go into the area, they would rent these costumes of the Tibetan traditional clothing and just take touristy photos in those areas. But I really don't know too much about Tibetan textiles. Sorry.
Thank you. CJ, I've got a question for you. I was really interested in Pacita Abad's work. And there's a couple of things, and I'm a bit of a techie when it comes to textiles. So I'm just going to ask you a couple of questions. One is, when you're talking about the way in which she works, you refer to it as collage. And those of us perhaps who work with textiles might recognize that as patchwork or applique. And I wondered why you use that term and not applique. And then secondly, on a similar tone, and I'm not critiquing you, I haven't wanted to have this conversation. When you're talking about the Trapunto technique, you then also went on to talk about how it flattens and collapses the frame. And yet, in a way, the Trapunto does quite the opposite. And it fills it out and it gives it sort of form and structure. And I just wondered how you are working with the sort of technical techniques within textile practices and the sort of perhaps the modernist artistic language, and whether that was important to Pacita Abad's work or not.
Thanks for that great question. In terms of collage, I'll just be candid. I sort of spoke off the cuff. So I actually, in my paper, I'm relying on this term called femage, which is a kind of portmanteau that was created during the aegis of the pattern and decoration movement that speaks to this kind of elision between feminine modes of weaving and textile and this modernist collage. So even though Pacita Abad didn't directly identify or associate with that movement, I believe that she's very much in line with the kind of ethos or the way of making that proposes. And with my work in particular, I'm dealing with global modernity, or global modernities and how they splinter, how they disperse, and the conflicts and ruptures and upheavals that exist within them. So in terms of Pacita Abad, she wasn't necessarily interested or invested in kind of framing herself against a modernist paradigm, but art historically, you see these kind of not necessarily modernist stakes, but the stakes that come with going against a modernist grain. So art historically, I didn't mention this because I only had 15 minutes, but the advent of kind of post-war Philippine art history, which artists like Pacita Abad and David Medalla really tried to resist or to expand, was one that was deeply modernist and kind of interested in replicating Western modes of abstraction and conceptualism. And so that's definitely percolating in this artistic atmosphere. The second thing is, as I briefly alluded to in my talk, is thinking not about artistic or aesthetic modernity, but about a kind of economic or political modernity. And I think that's where that kind of meeting point or that point of collision exists. But as you might imagine, I take a bit more of a holistic and perhaps I wouldn't say holistic, but I take a very kind of liberal and flexible and malleable approach to textiles. And I think it'll be good to kind of parse out the details and the technicalities of that. Thanks.
So a question from Marta, who is watching on our live stream, has a question for Yupeng. Would a more diverse staff/curatorial team in museums be helpful in dealing with this otherness of minorities? It's a big question, but I
have to think very carefully before I answer. Well, I feel like it's brought up a lot when I was actually interning at the Penn Museum, which I first encountered these textiles and wanted to actually seriously study them. This conversation of decolonizing the museum that I'm sure everyone has heard a lot about in the past few years, and I'm not sure. I think so. But I think more importantly, it's about ethical practice in museums. I personally don't think more diverse staff necessarily will make our practice more ethical, but of course that would help too.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I mean, is there anyone else on the panel that perhaps wants to speak to this question? Camilla, perhaps?
It's a big question, of course, so I have to think about it myself. And I don't know, I think that with still trying to process all the issues of contemporaneity from both a theoretical approach and practical approach, I think we will find a kind of balance also in the practice, little by little, of course.
Lovely, thank you. Go on, go for it.
No, we definitely don't have a final answer to this question, but I remember from when I was interning at the Salapare last year to hear this presentation from someone in the team of the organization of Combat Prize, which was a contemporary art prize that the museum was organizing. Böttcherstraße. And I remember them showing graphs and percentages, and they directly reflected the change into the team working on the prize. So you could see throughout the years, by diversifying the team in terms of age, gender, ethnicity, that also the participants and winners of the prize changed dramatically. So I'm not saying that clearly an ethical practice like Yupeng was suggesting should be at the basis, but I think, or like what was clear from this presentation that this person gave, and that we as people can probably feel and understand ourselves, is that we understand better artists coming maybe from our same background. So I think it is.
That's so interesting. I feel like from those answers we've discovered that perhaps there is no one answer, but instead it's this kind of constellation of different practices that are being brought in different places and understanding their impact and developing from there. Do we have any other questions from the audience? Yep, here.
I have a question for Camilla. So I was really fascinated by Maria Lai's woven books, but specifically her autobiography, which kind of has this like concrete poetry aspect to it. Could you just give us a little more detail? Like, how did she shift from this very personal, like written, woven language into these almost like, I don't want to say kid-friendly, but these almost, like kid-friendly woven books that kind of call to mind fairy tales?
The aspect related to the topic of the ludic aspect of art is something that I think has always been part of her artistic practice. In all the interview that we have, both written and the video interview, she always bound together, tied together this ludic aspect with the others big questions like what is the meaning of art, how we can use it for different purposes, especially also didactic purposes. And I think that it's all everything is part of a reflection, and of course it is also very related to her life and personal skills and inclinations. She always spoke about her childhood while speaking of her heart. So I think that it's really significant to understand this passage. It was everything, I think, in her mind. She just practices with the several media to try to express it visually, I think, and conceptually too. I hope to have answered your question.
Okay, so we're just coming to the end of our Q&A period. We have time for a short break now. There's restrooms just where you came in, and we'll convene here at about 1:45, so in about 15 minutes. Of course, feel free to ask any questions that you may not have had a chance to in the break.